Hello everyone. Here we are for another lecture. So today I will talk about, we will start actually talking about this 18th century, the classical period, what we call the classical period. And I'm sure you may have heard about this term, which refers to the period that goes from about 1750 to 1825. Um, why is it called the classical period? So first of all, because during this time, in the 18th century, there was um, a revival, so a new interest toward classical antiquity, so toward the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. And there were a lot of archaeological discoveries. Again, the term comes from art history, is not from musicology. This is just in the slides you can see I included some information concerning the what is going on around the world. So some inventions, some names of very famous classical painters: Goya, Constable de la Croix, Fragonard. These are just pictures. So obviously I'm not going to be in the exam, but they're useful to see so you understand the context of what we are discussing. So one important thing is that now music, like all the arts, has been supported by the monarchs, by the not just the church, so the aristocracy, so the rich nobles. And that's very important because a lot of famous musicians, including Mozart, which we'll discuss today, were actually dependent on a noble, on a rich person. Vienna becomes one of the most important centers for music. So this will be in the exam, as you can see, is underlined here. So will definitely be in the exam. So we talked about how Italy until the 17th century was very important for the development of different genres of music, and Vienna in the 18th century also becomes a very important center for music. For a lot of composers like Beethoven and Mozart went to Vienna to work. Some characteristics of musical characteristics of the music of this period are, first of all, the explosion, the diffusion of comic opera and serious opera. So opera becomes a very important vehicle for musical vehicle, also political vehicle in general. Then a lot of percussion instruments are being used in orchestras, and then the attention to form. So to form means to musical form. Some innovations, so the symphony, the sonata form, the string quartets, and again, I said already, opera. That's just a picture of orchestra, the symphonic orchestra that you may, if you go to a concert today, or if you went to a concert today, you probably saw an orchestra live. Some of the most famous classical composers of this period, so I'm referring to the classical period. So Gluck, you probably don't know him, Haydn maybe, Mozart, probably, Beethoven for sure, and Schubert, perhaps. So definitely Mozart, Beethoven, I'm sure you heard about them. This is just a picture of Gluck, Mozart, and so on. These are all the painters. All the composers just mentioned. The piano, which is called the pianoforte, becomes a very important instrument. So the piano, it was invented in the early 18th century in Florence, but by this time it becomes very important because they needed instruments that were loud. Because now music is not just performed in small spaces, but in large theaters. So they needed to have instruments that could produce louder sounds, and they could also have dynamic ranges. So they could play slowly, fast. They could play strongly, softly, and so on. Because of opera, I would say, first of all, we say that there are two different kinds of opera. So there's a comic opera and there's a serious opera. The difference between the two is obvious. So the comic opera was supposed to be entertaining, was supposed to make you laugh. Serious opera was more dramatic. There are two characteristics of these two terms that you have to know here for the exams, or recitative. And the recitative is basically when you have a full orchestra playing while a singer is performing, is singing, while the other one is the full orchestra, so you have you don't have anything. So one you have the full orchestra, which is the second one, and one you have no orchestra performing on the stage. Comic opera, which is called opera buffa, it is the Italian term for comic opera, and usually made fun of the aristocracy. It was supposed to be funny, it was supposed to entertain, it was supposed to be silly. There was nothing serious about it, and could be accessible to the lower classes as well, not just the aristocracy. And so it was simple. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be a reality on the stage. The stories of these operas were supposed to be accessible to the lower classes. Because the stories were simple, then also the music had to be simple. So because they were comic operas, they were comic entertainments. So they're supposed to be rapid, fast, simple melodies, so simple tunes, simple harmonies, right? In France, opera buffa was called opera comique. That's the French term for comic opera. But in France, the situation was a little bit difficult because Italian opera was not welcomed at the beginning for political reasons. Um, and in fact, it was what we called the querelle de Buffon, which was a quarrel between those who supported French opera and those who supported Italian opera in France. And some of those people were Lully, Rameau, and Jacques Rousseau. In England, comic opera was called ballad opera, which is the same thing, it's just it was in English, not in Italian nor in French. And again, the same concept applies. So in ballad opera, like in Italian comic opera, you had familiar tunes, very funny, stories, and so on. And one of the first examples of a ballad opera in England, so written in English, in the English language, was John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, which is very famous. And it tells the story of a captain falling in love for a rich English lady, right? And it's supposed to be a funny story. In Germany, or actually in German speaking territories, the comic opera was called Singspiel. The Singspiel was basically a comic opera written in German. Okay, one example of a Singspiel is Mozart's Magic Flute, which is very famous, the Magic Flute of Mozart. So again, to summarize for the exam, so English opera is called ballad opera, Italian comic opera is called opera buffa, and French comic opera is called opera comique, and German comic opera is called Singspiel. Now, serious opera. So we talked about comic opera so far. Now we'll talk about serious opera. As I said at the beginning, serious opera was addressed more to the higher classes because it was more sophisticated. So it required the knowledge, right? That's why it was still based a lot on mythology, historical subjects, and I wouldn't say intellectual, but yes, more intellectual stories, I would say. Gluck was one of the most important composers, was not the most important, was one of the most important composers of serious opera in the 18th century. And he tried to reform opera in the sense that he was not happy with some of the things that were happening on the stage. And in particular, he was criticizing the excessive virtuosity of the singers, because the singers were kind of today we would say showing off on the stage, and he was demanding more simplicity on the stage on opera. And there is actually one piece in this opera, which is Orfeo and Eurydice, which is you can see the YouTube link below, which will be in the next quiz. So you have to remember who composed this piece, which is What Shall I Do Without Eurydice, and you should know the title and the name of the composer, which is Gluck. And in opera, in French serious opera is called tragédie lyrique. That's the name to refer to. That's the term to refer to a French serious opera. Mozart, you should know him. I'm sure you've heard about Mozart, very important composer. He was the son of Leopold Mozart. He was also a musician, a composer. And Mozart himself, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, was born in 1726, sorry, 1756, in Salzburg, a small town in Austria. Here is a picture of Salzburg. And he was very prolific as a child. So he was 5 years old. He was already composing music and was writing music for different instruments, including violin, piano, harpsichord, and other instruments as well. And he was so famous. He was so such a genius at that time that the king also recognized his talent and called him in Vienna also to compose music and to perform. Then eventually married Costanza Weber in 1782, and we know that in 1787 he met Beethoven. So they met in Vienna. So we know that Beethoven arrived in Vienna to study with Mozart. That's all we know, though. We don't know anything else. That's a manuscript of the Requiem Mass, which was not completed by Mozart because he died in 1791. So while he was writing this piece, he died. So he did not finish it. And it's part of the 20. There also Mozart also composed 20 operas. So the total is 8 series opera. So 8 opera series, 7 opera buffa, which are comic operas, and 5 Singspiel, which are German comic operas, like as I mentioned earlier already. There are 3 of those operas, which are The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, which are actually comic operas, so they're written in Italian, not in German. Even though Mozart was Austrian, so they speak German there, he was writing operas in Italian because that was kind of a tradition still a tradition at that time. For this opera, he collaborated, for these 3 operas, he collaborated with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte. So he was writing the story. So da Ponte was the guy who actually was writing the text for the operas, not the music. Then going back to Mozart's Requiem Mass, the Requiem Mass was actually not completed because he died. He was completed by Count von Walsing, who was a noble there, and he commissioned Mozart to write this opera. We don't know why he commissioned it. But again, like I said, the Requiem was never completed, so it was finished by his student. His name was Franz Sussmayer. And this actually, the picture I'm showing you here is actually where Mozart left off. That's where he left off. That's where he finishes. That's his handwriting, and that's where he stopped. Okay. I'm gonna stop here for now. I'm gonna come back with another video.